If you just Google faith of our founders or, religious views of the founders or something, you will again find books and articles and websites, and speaking engagements, people trying to sell themselves for speaking engagements on this particular issue. And I don't know if this is 100% certain, but at least in what research I've done, this is a really uniquely American thing. And let me do a little thought experiment to kind of show you what I mean. So I'm going to ask you a question. Did the framers of Cameroon's constitution attend regular religious services? Right, Cameroon has a constitution. So I don't know, did they? Did the writers of Portugal's founding documents believe in a personal immanent God or a distant uninvolved deity? Right, what was their views? Did the ratifiers of South Korea's constitution base their governmental structures on biblical principles and religious doctrines? Now, if my thought experiment is working, you're probably thinking, that's a really weird question. That's a really, maybe even like, that's just like, it's beside the point. Who cares? Who cares what Cameroon's framers, what they do on Sunday or Saturday or whatever, right? Who cares? In America, however, these questions are very real and very present, and these questions, incite a lot of fury and backlash and an entire industry of points and counterpoints, people publishing books and articles trying to argue in one direction or the other. And here's just a little example of that. So this is a really famous, this is an engraving, which is why it's like black and white. So engraving is like a print. It's an engraving based on a painting. I believe the painting is lost to time. But this is, if you just Google, like, again, Founding Fathers faith or Founding Fathers prayer, this image will inevitably come up. President Ronald Reagan had this to say: "The most sublime picture in American history is George Washington on his feet in the snow at Valley Forge." Right. So again, this picture, I think, is a good encapsulation of this idea that, like, for millions and millions and millions of Americans, the question of were the Founding Fathers Christians, what was their faith, what did they believe, is really important. And this picture, for a lot of people, is an important symbol of their view of the founders' faith. However, here's another quote about this painting. This certainly almost did not happen. This quote was from me. Long story short, this story of President Washington, or he wasn't president then, of General Washington praying at Valley Forge, certainly one of the most important battles that kind of decided the eventual victory for the American colonists. There's a story of this one particular person who actually was a Quaker, interestingly enough, who witnessed George Washington praying. Long story short, historians have said that the guy who said he saw this didn't even live in that area until like 3 years after this happened or whatever. So it probably didn't really happen. But the point is, but I think, again, this is a good metaphor. Whether or not this happened is almost irrelevant. What is relevant is that this picture and the feelings some people have around it really capture the spirit and kind of the heat of this debate. So I'm going to unpack this a little bit. What did the founders believe, and why does it matter? The founders overwhelmingly believed that God existed. And again, there's a range. Some, very few though, were Orthodox Christians. So I mean Orthodox, not, there's like Eastern and Greek Orthodox. I don't mean Orthodox in that sense. I mean Orthodox, which again is a nebulous term, but just kind of believing the basic tenets of kind of traditional Christianity, right? That the Bible is God's word, that Jesus was, the incarnation of God, and that Jesus died for our sins, right? This is basic Christianity, Orthodox Christianity 101. Some founders did believe that. Others, on the other extreme, believed in nature's God, which is a deist concept in which the creator had no dealings with humanity. So deists believe God made everything, but was just like peace out and just kind of left things the way they were. So some founders were deists. On the other end of the spectrum, some founders were Orthodox Christians. However, I think the dominant view amongst the founders was this idea of providence. So think of providence as like a middle ground between orthodoxy and nature's God. So in this view, God directly shaped the history of the revolution and the founding era. So, again, a lot of Christian nationalists pull these out and throw them up on the internet. There's a bazillion quotes from the founders about providence smiling on them and helping them win the revolution and things like that, right? However, providence was a nebulous Enlightenment concept that did not necessarily comport with the specific attributes of the God of the Bible, right? So Orthodox Christians believe that, like, God has certain attributes. The kind of the founders who were more influenced by the Enlightenment than they were by the Bible overwhelmingly would not say that the God talked about in the Bible is the God we believe. They had a more kind of nebulous idea, but certainly the vast majority of the founders believe that God existed and that God had dealings with the world, and providence, this concept of providence, was their way of articulating that. Now, there were some more conservative Christians who used providence in the more kind of orthodox sense, but for the most part, this is how the founders used it. Here's an example. There's a letter from George Washington talking about his experience in the Revolutionary War. By the all-powerful dispensations of providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability and expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt. So George Washington is a great example. And the founders wrote a lot of stuff, and in all of George Washington's letters, I think he mentions Jesus like one time, like ever. And he never talked about his religious beliefs, but he talked about providence a lot, right? And again, I think this captures this idea that like there is this God out there, and that God is favoring, at first, the revolutionary colonists, and later on, it is favoring the United States, right? And providence captures this idea. Here's another example. The Declaration of Independence opens, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So again, this is something that sometimes like Christian nationalists will point to and say, hey, this proves that they were all Christians. However, these are not Orthodox Christian beliefs. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not biblical concepts. Natural rights, unalienable rights, right? This idea that like there are certain rights that we have that no government can take away. That is not a biblical concept. Now, again, there are Christian nationalists who have like, kind of stretched and strained certain Bible verses to prove this. But these are like Enlightenment values. But again, they're Enlightenment values that are shaped by, kind of some Christian ideas running in the background, right? I mean, clearly they believed in a creator. But again, this creator, in some of the minds of the founders, this creator was not the specific creator like perfectly illustrated in the Bible. Some of them did believe that, but most of them did not. This was the Enlightenment talking. This is not Orthodox Christianity talking. The founders, this is a really important point too. The founders were overwhelmingly privileged, college-educated elites. I often think, there's a lot of kind of populism in the United States, and some of that populism is surrounded around talking about how great the founders were. And I'm always like, if you met the founders, you would hate them because they were like totally like, they were elites. They were not common people. Back then, the Bible was both a basic component of elite education and a major shared cultural touchstone with the common folk, right? So yes, it is true that the Bible was a huge deal in that culture, right? If you went to college, which very few people did, generally speaking, only wealthy people did, you studied the Bible in as part of that curriculum. You also studied, Cicero and Homer and all, the Greek and Roman greats, which was, huge influence on the founders as well. But the founders were influenced by the Bible. They quoted the Bible, right? Providence and these other ideas, although they're more Enlightenment concepts, you can read them as relating to the Bible. So naturally, they quoted and alluded to the Bible often, and that happens today, right? Almost every politician, almost everybody that runs for president has to talk about their faith and quote the Bible at some point to like appeal to voters, right? And so, in that way, it was a huge part of their life because they studied it and they grew up on it and they read it and they knew it. So of course, they're going to reference it in their public quotes and whatnot. The founders believed that virtue, which was favoring the common good over one's personal interests, was crucial to the success of the American experiment in democracy. So again, virtue today, it's a word that we don't use very often. It's a word that has some different senses, but for the founders, the word virtue was deeply important. Why? Well, because they just fought a revolution. They were trying this new thing out. When I say experiment in democracy, I mean, America was an experiment, right? They didn't know it was going to work. And there were several points where they thought, oh crap, all of our hard work is going to go to pot because of some rebellion or, some group of armed people who's trying to, overthrow the Massachusetts state government or something. We'll talk about that more when we talk about the Second Amendment. Right? So, and they weren't sure it was going to work. So how would it work? Well, virtue, right? They deeply believed that in order for this democracy thing to work, that the masses of people were going to have to care more about the common good, what's good for everybody, than necessarily what was good for themselves, which is why we talked about individualism a few weeks ago, or a few classes ago, which is why when individualism started to become such a thing, they were so worried. They considered religion to be the best promoter of virtue, which is why they talked about religion all the time. So in this way, their views of faith were far more pragmatic and Republican, small r Republican, in other words, like benefiting the Republic, than Orthodox, right? Here is an example of that. Only a virtuous is, this is Benjamin Franklin, one of the kind of 6 or 7 most influential founders. Only virtuous people are capable of freedom, right? Notice he didn't say only a Christian people, only an Orthodox Christian people, right? The founders believed virtue was the linchpin, right? Virtue was the thing that was going to make this republic fall or continue. And how do you promote virtue? Well, in their context, the best way to promote virtue was religion, right? Christianity in particular, right? Because again, they came from a culture like overwhelmingly influenced by Christianity. So again, it's kind of like putting the cart before the horse. A lot of times people will say, the founders talked about how important Christianity was all the time, which is true, and this proves that they were Christians. And again, it's like, well, if you look at the deep context, that's not necessarily true. The founders all had Christian upbringings, right? They all knew the Bible, but they were coming out of the Enlightenment. That was their main framework. And when they were talking about the importance of religion, it's because religion supported virtue and not the other way around.